I've always wondered, and I've always been curious about why people act in the way they do, why nations act the way they do. And ultimately, nations act in the way they do because people have certain interests. And I don't like to look at it in a very transactional sense. I think seeing it in terms of just a short-term benefit or interest almost demeans how deep and insightful human culture can be, and humanity can be, in fact. And so I've always liked to look at the way that nations behave in terms of how people themselves behave. And one of the best frameworks that I came across was reading this book called The End of History by, famous book by Francis Fukuyama, in which he postulates this time where all of the world's challenges and problems disappear, and there are no more problems to solve, and therefore history ends. Now, obviously, in a very weird philosophical sense, despite the different interests that all of the units that the world is made up of behave and act, we're in a sense moving towards, at least hoping towards that place where we can overcome all these challenges. Okay? It's a pursuit of power, yes. But that pursuit of power, the means of that, or the objective, has to be ultimately overcoming challenges. And all of our nations, all of our communities are kind of headed there. And so he talks about this end of history. And he also quotes Hegel. And this is something that really struck me, in which he speaks of Hegel's definition of why human beings act the way they do and what really differentiates us from other creatures. And this is really, really important, because what Hegel says is that human beings, unlike other animals, have an innate desire to be recognized, to be treated with dignity, an innate sense of justice. And you can see it even from a child, an infant. If you give a child something and you pull it out of his or her hand, they're going to grimace. They won't like it, because we have this sense of justice. We have this need for dignity and to be recognized. And I think this is often what drives humanity's weird behavior. It's far beyond biological needs. Obviously, we all have biological needs which are similar to other creatures. But that need for recognition and to be treated with dignity is something that we can call our own. And I think this is really interesting, because if you go even back to what Plato, and in his, obviously his greatest piece, his masterpiece, The Republic, he speaks of the human soul, and he describes it in three parts: the desiring part, the reasoning part, and this part called the thymus, which is the spiritedness of the soul. And this is really important, because what he describes as the spiritedness of the soul is this part that we all possess, that refuses to accept injustice and fights for recognition. Now, this was lost for thousands of years when the world was basically divided, or the peoples of the world were basically either masters or slaves. But it sort of ended with the American and French revolutions, when, with the birth of liberal democracy, what happened was the agency of the individual was enhanced and valued. And with the agency of the individual becoming enhanced and valued, that need to recognize our individual dreams and hopes was tethered to the interests of our nations. And that's how nations were born. Our own individual reasons to be recognized were tethered to those of our communities, those of our nations. And so today we have hundreds of nation states that vie to be recognized. We call it geopolitics. We call it global power play. But in actual fact, it's a lot deeper than that. What we really are doing is we're trying to be recognized. We're trying to be treated with dignity. And I think that's why nations sometimes behave in such inexplicable ways. They do such strange things. Because the peoples of the world will not accept injustice. They'll accept wars, they'll fight wars, sometimes for nothing. Not for resources, not for oil. They'll fight wars because of injustice. And people will decide to give their life away for justice and against injustice. This is really important, I think, because I tend to think of geopolitics not as isolated incidents and then reactions to it. It's, I think, a very simplistic way to look at geopolitics, which is why I love what Klaas is doing with the risk assessment. I'm going to come to that in a little bit. But I think it's really important that we have a longer term view in terms of a trajectory of geopolitics. Where is all of this headed? And I think this is important because if we are to look at the trajectory the world is taking today, and if someone were to say that I can tell you in 5 years or 10 years, this is exactly what's going to happen, this is going to be the state of the world, it would be very difficult for any of us, with any kind of experience to believe that person. I think what's important is for us to be able to recognize the signs that exist right in front of us, decipher them, and then be able to have the agency to create our own future. Now, this is important. Marx famously said that philosophers interpret the world when the whole point is to change it. And someone diametrically different to Marx was Tim Berners-Lee, the creator or the father of the World Wide Web. And he said, we're not just imagining the world, we are creating it. So the same idea. And I think this is really super important for a country like Sri Lanka. Why do I say that? Understanding the geopolitical imperatives that exist today poses Sri Lanka with a choice. It's pretty simple. It's quite unlike the choices before Australia and New Zealand. Sri Lanka has been a passive participant in other people's geopolitics. But today we have the opportunity to take a decision. We can decide to see what happens, which is pretty typically Sri Lankan, or we can decide to make it happen. And I'll tell you why that opportunity exists today more than before. The reason is digital systems today have completely upended geopolitics. And this is something that we have to come to terms with. If you go back into human history, I think for the vast majority of the existence of Homo sapiens, 99.5% of our existence has been in the Paleolithic era. We then kind of, the period where we use very primitive tools. Maybe, and that all ended 12,000 years ago with the end of the Ice Age. Maybe civilizations as we know it began maybe 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. Compared to the 3 million years that we've existed using tools like stones and sticks, computers have been around for maybe 70 years. The mobile phones, the World Wide Web maybe 30 years, and mobile phones to the extent we use it today maybe 15 years. So blink of an eye. But you can see how quickly that age of acceleration has come upon us. And I think it's really important to think of a model to interpret the world, both in terms of prehistory, history, and of course, that period of acceleration. How has globalization and technological advancement impacted societies over the past couple of decades? And I think if you really study it, they've exchanged places at different times of the past 100 years. After World War II, after World War I rather, the world was in shambles and technological advancement overtook globalization and sped ahead. But then after the 1950s and 60s, maybe the last serious tech innovation was man making it to the moon, and that was 1969. I mean, we can argue that there were obviously advancements in computational power, which, yes, I will give you. But really, has life changed in terms of the kind of cars we drive? Essentially the same thing, the kind of houses we live in. Life has not really taken the leaps and bounds technologically that it did maybe 50 years ago. The sciences in particular. Except maybe genetic engineering. I think, for example, gene editing, the technology that we call CRISPR, using the Cas9 protein, maybe I don't know how many of you have heard of it here, but it's going to take over healthcare in maybe 5 years. We won't hear of it for another 5 years very often, but I think it'll trudge along through the quagmire of being accepted and marketed, and clinical trials and things like that. But CRISPR is going to wipe out genetic diseases maybe in the next 4 to 5 years. It's going to come upon us like AI has. And other than maybe genetic engineering and the bit revolution, I really can't say that we've had much of a technological revolution over the past 20 to 30 years. But globalization has certainly taken over the world. That need to be homogeneous in the kind of products we use, in the politics that we speak about, has overtaken technological advances until today, until now. With the sudden advent of AI, it's not sudden, it's been developed for decades, but with the power that AI presents today, I think it provides nations like Sri Lanka opportunity, but also clearly challenges. What was traditionally a physical geopolitic, where we had to contend with the interests of nations to take over territory or control territory, is today impeding on digital sovereignty. And why is digital sovereignty important? Quite simply, digital systems are going to be controlling every aspect of our life in so many ways. There's going to be scrutiny. Everything that we do today, already, Google knows, as we all know. So it's going to only increase, and then what do these systems do with that scrutiny is something that's going to be completely out of our hands. Perception influence. How will it provide and not provide information that will then influence our decisions? These are things that are not controlled by governments, my friends. These are now controlled by enormous tech firms, tech bros sitting somewhere in the world and deciding. And the problem and the challenge there is these enormously powerful entities are not politically sophisticated. It's important to understand these dynamics in a political, philosophical structure, because it's impossible for us, if we are to make high-quality decisions for our nations and our people, to set aside the vast and impressive body of knowledge that is political philosophy that has weathered the storms of thousands of years. We need those structures to help us interpret the future, the present and the future. But whether or not the technology companies that are going to control all of this power have that political sophistication is certainly going to be a challenge and a problem. And so it's really important for us to figure out that the future of power, particularly, is going to be out of parliaments, out of presidents, and in the hands of these technological companies or tech companies, organizations. In a sense, the powers of these companies may be well controlled by governments. And now that also becomes interesting for Sri Lanka. I talk about opportunities and challenges. Now, the challenges, of course, are the fact that most digital infrastructure and data flows are controlled by vastly two countries, United States and China. And for a country like Sri Lanka, which has about 4.5% of its GDP coming in from technology, with a dream to go up to 15%, each decision we make suddenly becomes a geopolitical imperative. Just like the ports of the past. You know, the ports we gave away and the ports that are being contested today? Well, the data centers that we decide to create, the organizations we decide to partner with, and the nations that we decide to work with will have vast implications on our digital sovereignty. And it's very important for Sri Lanka to realize that as much as these are challenges, it also poses an opportunity for us to make it happen. To create that future, create that trajectory, and leapfrog to where many of us believe our true potential lies. And to do that, it's very key that we protect our digital sovereignty. Now, I don't mean avoid working with X country or Y country. What I do mean is retaining our digital autonomy. Because if we don't retain our digital autonomy, we're going to realize that it's akin to handing over parcels of land in different parts of Sri Lanka, strategic parcels of land. There's no difference. It's the same thing, if not worse. Because we won't be able to control our drive towards that potential. Great examples are Estonia and Singapore, small countries which have retained control of their digital sovereignty. Sri Lanka is a lot weaker in that sense, but they've still figured out ways to protect their infrastructure, to make sure that their data is retained within Sri Lanka or within the country, but also they've made sure that they have indigenous technological developments, particularly in AI, so that they could have the autonomy of making decisions by themselves. And they've really made successes out of it. And I think it's also in the interest of Sri Lanka's true partners to support Sri Lanka's strive to protect its digital sovereignty. Because any attempt to weaken it would be similar to beginning some kind of geopolitical strife or battle or war, which will ultimately be counterproductive to the region and the world. Purely because Sri Lanka sits in such a strategic location. And I think a prosperous Sri Lanka, a Sri Lanka that reaches out to her potential, is in everyone's interest. And so when we think about geopolitical risks and geopolitics itself, I think what's happened is the rug's been pulled from under our feet because we're focused on the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, what President Trump's up to, what's going on here, what's going on there. When NVIDIA announces yesterday that it's valued at $5 trillion, is in the world's third largest economy after America and China. So this is not philosophy anymore. It's reality. In my travels, I try to spend as much time as I can meeting with the indigenous peoples of different parts of the world. And a couple of years ago, I was in Western Australia and got to spend some time with First Nation people of that part of Australia. And they were so kind that this group of Australian First Nations people, they took me on a kangaroo hunt, which I'm not sure how many Australians have done, frankly, Larita. But for me, it was such an incredible experience because of the way in which they approached the kangaroo hunt. I promise you I'm going somewhere with this, okay? We're kind of accustomed to standing upright and looking forward at the horizon towards what we want or what we want to avoid, an opportunity or a risk, correct? That's what we're used to doing. We stand up and we look around. But during this hunt, these men were basically staring at the ground, maybe a few feet in front of their feet. And what seemed to me like an eternity, maybe 5 or 6 hours, I was just following. I had no idea what was going on. In what seemed to be just walking around in circles in, the Australian outback, which is not a very comfortable place to be to begin with. And in the middle of the day, walking around, following these guys who were just like looking out just in front of their feet. And I couldn't understand why they wouldn't just, look out for a kangaroo, because a kangaroo hops around and, it's kind of easy to find. So I would just look around to see if I could see a kangaroo. I just couldn't. Several hours into this traumatic experience at the time, one guy came up to me and he said, okay, it's behind that outcrop of rocks. And I couldn't see a kangaroo. Okay, and then they started to raise their heads and they took their spears. And I won't go into the details, but at the end of the day, there was a kangaroo. We got the kangaroo. And that night, over a campfire, when I was talking to them, what they told me was that if they looked out into the horizon, their options are so limited. You can't see the kangaroo. Also, you can't see the dangers that might be on the other side of that horizon. And so what they instead focus on is what's in front of them. The information that would lead them to what they want and keep them away from what they don't want. Interpreting that data with experience and maturity is key. And you don't really need to know this incredible, massive goal or objective or where you're going if you are able to interpret what's in front of you and stay true to data and the truth. It will eventually lead you to where you want to go. And it will eventually lead you to things or potential that you never knew even existed. And I think it's really important that this lesson, and it's obviously worked for them for thousands of years. We can't be so full of ourselves as to think that we cannot learn something from these incredible people, because quite frankly, they've outlasted, they've lived for thousands of years and they've survived. So it works. And so that lesson of staying true to understanding the signs, a broken blade of grass, a footprint, whatever it is, being able to interpret it, that's also important, obviously, because to me, seeing a broken blade of grass means nothing. I would miss it completely. But to those experienced hunters who've done it for decades, they understood the direction, what kind of creature, just by a little sign. And so to depend on people who understand these signs and interpret them, and then have your footsteps guided, I think, in today's geopolitical scenario is key. Because we just don't know what's around the horizon. We just don't know. And so which is why when Dr. Vidanagay was talking to me about particularly the risk assessment, I thought it was a fabulous idea because it really helps interpret the signs. And with those interpretations come higher quality decisions. And with those higher quality decisions, I think, not just for corporates or for organizations, but for countries, will come opportunities. And I think if Sri Lanka, as a nation, can somehow get its digital game in order, and I think it's kind of headed there, we stand to be in a very unique position to leapfrog ahead of many other nations and get to a truly special place. If we miss this opportunity, we are going to be the guys others leapfrog over. And so that simplistic view of transactional geopolitics, it's over. It's very, very complicated. And it's complicated because what is digital is political, and what is political is geopolitical. And so to go back to where we started with Plato and Hegel, that human need to be recognized is something that I think our little nation also is desperate for. And that's why our people stepped out. And that's why and that's the only thing I think that we know about Sri Lankans, in that we just want to be treated with dignity. We don't want handouts. And so I think to be able to do that, this new digital revolution has truly provided us with a special opportunity. And if we can somehow make it and get it right, well, that opportunity is ours to take. Sometimes trying to marry philosophy and engineering is difficult. But I think the world needs philosophical engineers, people who both understand structures, complexity, vectors, and trajectories, but are also able to actively change trajectories, futures, and peoples. That power, I think, is in all of our hands today. It's in all of your phones today. And so instead of being passive observers or participants to where the world and our country is headed, we have the opportunity to be philosophical engineers, in that we think about the future of this country, to think about the future of the world, and we can very physically influence where we are headed with what we do and how we think about what we do. So instead of just waiting to see what happens, we make it happen.